Just a warning before we begin. As the Lamentations of the Flame Princess site says, the Carcosa setting contains explicit descriptions of vile black magic and violence. The discussion in this episode includes mentions of child harm, sexual violence, and human sacrifice, among other things, in the context of this fictional setting.
My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we travel to the strange and terrible planet of Carcosa.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl. Carcosa is a setting book written by Jeffrey McKinney and featuring art by Rich Longmore. It was originally published in a smaller pamphlet form in 2008, but was picked up by Lamentations of the Flame Princess and published in an expanded second edition in 2011. In this episode, we will be covering the first half of this expanded edition up through page 111, as well as the tables in the back of the book that start on page 238 and go until the end. So let's talk big picture backstory stuff. Carcosa is a strange planet, largely empty, but with the remnants of a number of civilizations which used to have dominion over it scattered about. The only race of people on the planet are humans, who come in 13 different colors. These humans were bred long ago by a race of wicked snake men for the express purpose of being sacrificed in rituals. The snake men are long gone, but these multi-hued humans remain, gathering in small tribes of light-colored people, doing their best to scavenge the technology and artifacts of the civilizations that preceded them, and to survive attacks from numerous monstrosities that stalk the lands, including the great old ones of the Cthulhu mythos. Aesthetically, it is a post-apocalyptic setting, but interestingly, there was never really an apocalypse. Carcosa has just always been awful and inhospitable.
And so to move on to the actual component parts of the book, after a short introduction during which the author, as is traditional, encourages you to use the material in the book in whatever way makes sense for your campaign, as if you weren't going to do that anyway, it begins with a short section talking about an unusual dice convention, weapon damage, and wounds for your characters. And from there it moves on to a chapter on creating characters for Carcosa, which includes a brand new class, the Sorcerer, a magic user of a particularly unusual bent, one might say. And then there's a note on the men of Carcosa, by which they mean, of course, the humans of Carcosa, and the 13 different colour-based varieties they come in, including the currently impossible colours of Jail, Dolm, and Olfire. There is a section on alignment, which explains that the only thing that matters is one's opinion of the great old ones, and then there is a section on psionics. The next chapter is a short one about the desert lotus flower of Carcosa and the various types of lotus powder that can be found, and the supernatural effects of ingesting or inhaling said powder. Next is a chapter on space alien technology. The space aliens are a highly advanced civilization that attempted to colonize Carcosa, and they brought with them robots, laser beams, battle armor, and other exciting and unpredictable sci-fi gear that you can find knocking about the place. Next is a chapter on the technological artifacts of the Great Race. So not to be confused with the space alien race, which presumably is why they have the modifier space in front of them. These aliens are in fact the Great Race from Lovecraft's works, and they left behind a number of large, powerful artifacts related to manipulating space and time and the mind. And then next is a chapter on yet more technological artifacts, but again of a different slant. These belong to the primordial ones, and they left behind artifacts related to the biological sciences.
The next part of the book is one of the largest and almost certainly one of the most controversial. That is the section related to the sorceress rituals. These rituals are almost exclusively related to the Great Old Ones and other monstrosities that inhabit Carcosa. And these come in a number of different categories: banishing, conjuring, invoking, binding, imprisoning, and tormenting. Although, note, they are not actually divided in the book that way, but they are noted what type they are. Next comes the monster descriptions, which is the setting's bestiary. Most of these monsters are from the Cthulhu mythos, statted out for Lamentations of the Flame Princess, but many of the monsters are also original to the book. And then finally, the last part of the book that we're going to cover in this episode are the tables that start on page 238, which include a number of helpful things: wilderness encounters, underground encounters, tables for generating the spawn of Shub-Niggurath, the space alien armament tables, the random robot generator, the mutations table, and reference tables for the sorceress rituals.
Okay, so before we proceed, maybe let's clarify what our personal experience is with Carcosa, Jason. For me, it's only ever existed in Potentia in my longish-running World of Dungeons game. Carcosa was, if you remember Cologne, covered in a previous Fear of Black Dragon episode, if the player characters had ever travelled to the zone to the east where the wizards were having a massive war, that would have been Carcosa. But as it was, it really only existed as a kind of inflection of various magics that I described. But you've used it rather more extensively than that, right?
I have used it a fair amount, yeah. I've used the Carcosa book in 3 short campaigns of Adventures on Dungeon Planet, which is Johnstone Metzger's science fantasy version of Dungeon World, as well as 2 short campaigns of Dungeon World. And I'm presently, in fact, starting tonight, running it as a hex crawl in World of Dungeons. So yeah, I've got quite a bit of experience with the book. Based off of your read of it, though, Tom, what did you like about this section of the Carcosa book?
Well, to begin with, I like the overall inspiration for the book, which is, I mean, it's not exclusively based on this, obviously, as we may discuss later, but a lot of it draws on the very kind of I want to call it pre-Tolkien fantasy. It's not necessarily pre-Tolkien, because I'm thinking about things like Gormenghast, which is coterminous with Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit as well, or A Voyage to Arcturus, of which more later, and The Worm of Oberos, which was a sort of, again, interplanetary fantasy. It's not quite like the science fantasy things you get with, say, Northwest Smith or John Carter of Mars, but it has that kind of thing to it. And it's a slightly kind of aloof aesthetic kind of take on interplanetary journeys and weird philosophies and stuff like that. And there's definitely, indisputably, A Voyage to Arcturus is an inspiration for this, because it's quoted directly in the book as the source of the impossible colours.
It is indeed, yeah.
So, yeah, I'm very glad to see that, because I'm not really that into D&D fantasy. So whenever I see an OSR thing that comes along and is based on something more, well, not unusual, but just taking its cues from a different base, I always find that interesting and kind of innately appealing.
That's actually a pretty good segue for one of the things that I love about the book. So I think it's interesting that you found enticing about Carcosa its inspirations from pre-Tolkien fantasy and just older sort of fantasy works. I actually have a slightly different take on it. So Carcosa for me exists in this really specific space in my brain, which is the part of my brain that loves 70s and 80s genre film and genre, TV shows and things, particularly the fantasy and science fiction stuff from that era that kind of has inspired the present day synthwave music scene, which you and I are big fans of, right? So, this is really, there's one of my companion adventures that I'm going to talk about actually helped clarify my thinking on this a lot. And I'm leaning on that a little bit because, when I was thinking about what I love about Carcosa a few years ago, when I first grabbed the book, I was trying to verbalize this exact thing, right? Which is, so if you think about my age group, I come from an age group that kind of missed white box D&D and kind of missed all of those very Tolkien inspired fantasy things that were kind of really taking off in the late 70s and early 80s, right? And so for me, my approach to fantasy, my approach to sword and sorcery was through the awful American cartoon show Masters of the Universe, right? Or He-Man, if you will.
Yeah.
He-Man, we called it as kids. No one called it Masters of the Universe, right? Its formal proper name is Masters of the Universe. So Masters of the Universe was this syndicated cartoon show that was designed specifically to sell toys, right? It had that was its major innovation, was we're going to sell toys via this cartoon, right? But, if you were my age, if you were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old when that show was on, and I was, this was huge. This was a really, really big deal for little American boys of that age, right? And so so to me, Carcosa resonates because it feels like Masters of the Universe that was designed instead for like edgy teenagers of the 80s rather than little kids of the 80s. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
To quote my companion adventure coming up, this is from Robert Parker, a blogger. Stuff like Carcosa, he's not talking specifically about Carcosa, but I'm going to paraphrase him a bit. Carcosa is it's the He-Man that ought to be, right? Not the He-Man that we had, right? And so, like, if you look at stuff in Carcosa, you've got robotic dinosaurs. You've got this fusion of machine and organic matter. You've got this large empty planet. You've got foul sorcerers. There's an emphasis on color. Color is a really big deal. Like, just the idea of a big, colorful setting. All that stuff, like, really resonates with me. And I think that's kind of that's a bit nebulous, this point I'm making, but essentially, Carcosa reads to me like my entry into sword and sorcery, like kind of magnified, right? And made sort of whole, if that makes sense.
It kind of does. And actually, I think it's interesting that I can definitely see the link now, especially to maybe not Masters of the Universe or He-Man or whatever the heck it was called, or indeed She-Ra, Princess of Power, but that kind of genre of 80s cartoons that was done for merchandising, because some of them, I think maybe not Masters of the Universe, I think Transformers was designed to kind of create a marketing vehicle for toys that originally in Japan were not even from the same toy line, right? That's why some of the Transformers don't really make much sense.
Right.
Because they're from different, like totally different franchises. And so the poor scriptwriters were given like, yeah, just make all these characters into one thing. You'll do it. You can do it, guys. Yeah. So yeah, you've got space aliens and Lovecraft and kind of, yeah, like you say, the 70s fantasy things where they couldn't really afford many extras or populated sets. So they tended to be set in deserts. It all kind of just about works together. And it's up to you to pick the bits that appeal to you, I think.
I want to just quote Robert Parker again here because I love this. Just vis-a-vis He-Man, and this idea of like there being a connection here, right? Which is, he says, I'm talking about intergalactic vampire warlords invading your sword and sorcery world and installing satanic lich kings in a bid for colonial rule. Pterodactyl riders with laser guns in a dogfight with UFOs piloted by serpent men, cleaving through hordes of cyborg beastmen as we leap from asteroid to asteroid towards that leering organic castle in space. He's describing Masters of the Universe and also She-Ra, if you caught the vampire warlord part, right? But like those elements like just feel like Carcosa to me,
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is another part of the appeal, and maybe this is why it made me think of this, is another popular cartoon of that era was, of course, the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. And Carcosa strikes me as excellent for that kind of portal fantasy where you take characters from a more normal world and just kind of dump them in a kind of hellish desert landscape populated with monsters that don't make a whole lot of sense. Kind of living cheek by jowl.
You read the book and you wonder, like, how did Cthulhu and Hastur and the Great Ones, and how did they all end up in this place? It's never really explained.
And that is but you don't really need to. That's the best bit. Is the players will come up with some conjecture, and maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Doesn't really matter. But yeah, portal fantasy is that kind of that thing of Dungeons and Dragons. They get on it. Is it a roller coaster, something like that, and it takes them to another planet, or Chronicles of Narnia. Or indeed, most of those kind of 1920s science fiction things. Like Worm Ouroboros starts off as a portal fantasy because this guy, I think he goes into a trance and psychically projects to Venus or another planet. But then by chapter 3, the author has completely forgotten about it. The last time you see the Observer character, who's a normal human, is hiding behind a curtain while the main characters are having a conversation. And then he's never mentioned again.
It's funny you bring up portal fantasy because that's actually how I've used it. This brand new thing I'm starting for World of Dungeons that I mentioned at the top is going to be a little bit more like the book assumes you're going to run the game, right? Like as a hex crawl involving Carcosa natives. But what I've run before with Dungeon Planet and Dungeon World is something really quite different. It's for Dungeon Planet, the group has always been made up of half people from off-world and then half people from Carcosa, and the sort of merging of their cultures and having to join together to go across this terrible landscape to achieve some goal, right? For Dungeon World, it was actually like a really trippy interdimensional thing like that got them to Carcosa. Much, very, very similar to some of the things you mentioned, like some of those classic science fantasy things, right? And so that's really interesting because that's actually how I have used it. That actually makes a lot of sense. And I think part of that comes down to, I think this is a difficult setting to just like try to do natively. I'm going to find out tonight, but it seems really hard because there's not a lot of like civilization or anything to hang everything on, right? It's so sparse and so desperate,
Yeah, and was all the action like during the kind of on-camera action in Carcosa, or did you? Because one thing I was thinking was you could also use Carcosa as your kind of like the Upside Down in Stranger Things. It's a place that you don't really want to go to, but every so often you have to, and you would kind of go in and out.
No, my characters, they were like straight up in Carcosa. Yeah, they were in Carcosa, like physically in on the planet. In fact, that new podcast we launched, We Hunt the Keepers, the Dungeon World actual play, the third series of that one is called The Path to Dim Carcosa. And the whole first portion of it is about this sort of strange, psychedelic, sort of astral plane type journey to the planet.
Okay, cool.
Tom, what else did you like about this setting book?
Well, I think the final thing I'd like to call out is the sorceress rituals, and not particularly anything about their kind of content or like what they really do, but rather that they're all, like every single one is kind of an adventure by itself, because it links to some scary creatures and some locations, which is great for hex crawls, because deciding where to go is the big problem with hex crawls. So I think, it's just very simple. Show the player characters what the ritual is, either because they've been somehow compelled to go and seek out items for a wizard. Why does Zarjaz the sorcerer even want this stuff? And then they find out after they've delivered a couple of things that this terrible ritual is about to happen, or just let them see the recipe and they know they need to stop it, and let them head off and do what they're going to do.
Awesome. I agree. Well, so let's talk about questions we had. I know you had a few.
My first one was how have you used Carcosa in your games, but I think we've covered that. So my, or have we? I don't know.
Well, I'll just add this. I mean, I've never done it like a hex crawl, and I basically use it as a toolbox, and I think that's another great strength of the book, actually. It's a really, really fun toolbox. You can just kind of read through it, grab a couple of elements, locations, encounter ideas, and kind of just build out a little adventure from it. That's how I've always done it. I basically use it as I use the elements inside to sort of cobble together adventures, basically. I've never run it as a hex crawl. Not yet, anyway.
I suppose on that front, because there is, I think I would probably be much the same. Like Carcosa as a general setting, I think it's well put together and it's pretty good, but it doesn't really call out to me to run it. Like, I'm not in love with it in the same way that I am with some other things. So I would definitely be wanting to mine it for things. And to that end, I wonder if its presentation is as efficient as it could be. I mean, I kind of think that, for example, instead of like, how many pages of fully written out rituals is it? We could have had maybe 6 examples of worked out ones and a bunch of Yunsuin style tables, because they're all a little bit kind of, you need to sacrifice this many blank color people at this blank location. It takes roll d12 hours, that kind of thing. I mean, would that be a crashing disappointment, or what do you think?
I think it would be, and here's why. We're going to talk a little bit about the sorceress rituals and their presentation in the Expert Delve. But I will say right now at the outset that I do think that part of the charm of the book is how almost clinically presented everything is. Everything is presented like the fact that the rituals are presented in total, in fullness, right? Like the actual, recipe for doing the ritual. And there are a bunch of them, right? And they're all very specific and in the things you have to do. To me, I think it lends a sort of gravity to the proceedings. I think it makes the idea of these rituals being in the world feel a little bit more grounded and not just something that the GM is kind of like hand waving, right? I think the same is the case for the parts of the book, which we're not covering today, but like the hex crawl parts, or the stuff we are covering today, the fantastic detail in some of the tables. I actually like all of that because, like I said, I use it as big inspiration for putting together adventures. it's more helpful in the Carcosa context than Yunsuan because Yunsuan leans on real world elements. It's easier to, I think it's easier to fill in the blanks with Yunsuan than it would be with Carcosa. I like the detail in Carcosa.
Okay. Well, I have a further question about rituals while we're here. Tormenting rituals seem to basically be like binding rituals, but they take less time and don't work quite as well. Is there another difference that I've missed, or is that basically it?
I think that's it. I have not used the rituals in that way yet in the game. I use the rituals more as like a plot device than like, hey, we are doing the ritual, right? So I can't really speak to that, but I think that's my instinct, yeah.
Okay. We briefly glossed over the frankly bizarre dice mechanic that is presented at the beginning of the book, which involves rolling all of your polyhedrals every time you start a fight for your hit points and stuff like that. Have you ever actually used that?
Nope.
Would you?
I don't think so.
No, me either. But I do like that it's there.
Yeah.
I think that it kind of sets the stage in a mechanical way that you're never going to use for how odd the following content is going to be.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it is a weird detail. It's not what I come to the Carcosa book for, that part of it. So yeah, it just doesn't mean much to me.
No, although I will note that one of our preferred OSR module platforms, World of Dungeons, does kind of do the same thing with healing hit points because you reroll.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that is true. I mean, it is kind of like, I guess, in the spirit of it in a way. That's it.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, let's go to the Chain Lightning round. I'll start. There is an artifact called the Living Monolith, and the way it's described in the text is fucking horrifying. It's a 100-foot monolith that sticks straight up in the air. It's not perpendicular to the ground. In fact, everything else around it is what's askew, not the monolith. It screams sometimes, and biological fluid leaks from it, and you can use that material to create people. Just utterly bizarre and horrifying.
From the horrifying to the banal, I like how extensively internally linked the PDF is. You know, it'll mention a hex and you can click on the hex number and it goes to that bit of the PDF. That's good. More PDFs should do that.
My favorite monster in the bestiary is the Violet Mist. This is a sort of green polygonal gem thing that has this vampiric mist essentially kind of floating around it. It's highly deadly, and it's a fabulous dungeon world, dungeon planet, and I assume World of Dungeons monster/trap because it allows the players to use like their sort of discern realities investigation type moves to figure out like what animates the mist and what's going to happen if they, don't destroy the polygon and all that kind of stuff, right? So yeah, it's pretty cool.
The Desert Lotus produces many things, but my favorite of them is the White Lotus powder, and that is a drug that, when ingested, causes you to essentially kind of become a zombie. Like the first person to give you peremptory orders will become your master. So it is, in short, a Shakespearean comedy, but in snortable powder form.
I'm going to say the tables for constructing and putting together space alien armaments, they are fabulously detailed. And, in terms of like what type of microwave radiation do they have? And what sorts of, elements from the periodic table do their laser beams shoot? It's really cool. Like to shoot a beryllium laser beam is kind of a neat idea.
2 words for you. Mummy brains. Some more words for you. These are, well, it's the rest of the mummy has fallen away, but the evil wizard brain still lives. You can't move anywhere. It doesn't have hands, but it has powerful magics and is evil and will try and take your mind over. And in short, reminds me of the gigantic floating brains from Futurama.
Indeed. Well, and also like old 1950s, science fiction stuff, right?
Yeah, actually. Or the Invaders from Mars, the kind of Red Scare movie with the head in a jar who's the leader. That's pretty good.
My last thing is the random robot generator. Super helpful, not just for Carcosa. Really, really great tool. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. So today we're going to talk about playing with very dark and problematic content. And this conversation is going to be divided up into 3 sections. The first, we're going to talk about the controversies that surround this book, because I think they're important to bring up. The second thing we're going to talk about is our personal opinions on the matter, both just playing with dark content in general and also the Carcosa specific stuff. And the third thing is we're going to just briefly discuss safety tools and things like that for working with and including exceptionally dark content in your game. So let's talk about Carcosa. So when I first brought Carcosa to the table a while back, there were a few people in my group, at that time it was Face-to-Face Houston Gauntlet, who were really hesitant to play or get involved in those sessions. They were some of the only sessions I had a hard time filling initially. These players had kept up with the controversy surrounding the book, and they kind of couldn't believe like why I would want to engage with it, right? So from my vantage point, I was not playing role-playing games at all when Carcosa was first released and when the controversy about it was sort of raging. And so I came to it kind of later, and so I had a slightly different perspective, right? But basically it kind of boils down to this. Many of the rituals in the book involve human sacrifice. A number of them also include sexual predation, and they get really, really dark, down to like the rape and murder of children, okay, as a means to accomplish the ritual. One of the rituals, for example, is called the primal formula of the dweller, and it requires the mass murder of children by burning them, which is described in the text as a fiery holocaust. Pretty dark stuff, right, Tom?
Yeah, although I hadn't really noticed that phrase. Isn't fiery holocaust redundant? But anyway, it is dark. But I mean, I think probably the most off-putting thing is that it's so laid out. And actually, maybe you're right on the point of not having random tables for this. I think if you just had this is one of the possible options on a D12 roll for requirements, people would have kind of glossed over it because you could easily ignore it. But because the human sacrifice, I think it's actually all of them require some human sacrifice.
Not all of them. The banishment ones do not.
The banishment ones don't.
Importantly, that's right. Those do not. Yeah.
Yeah, that was it. That, I think, is what makes it so unavoidable. Because there is a lot of... Well, I think most D&D fantasy involves the threat of violence, sexual and otherwise, in monstrous ways. That's often, I mean, that's the implication when the orcs have kidnapped the villagers. Something bad is going to happen to them, but nobody ever has to think about what it is. Whereas here, it's written down and they've told you what it is, and it's really, really vile.
Well, it's like the classic argument on online forums, right? Of like, well, where do you think half orcs came from, right? You know, it's the implication for a lot of people. I'm not sure where I fall on this because I played 2E and you couldn't play a half orc in 2E, but
really, that's
so
your angle.
I haven't really thought about it, but the implication, of course, is that like the orcs were like raping women, and these were like half orc babies, right? Like that's what a lot of people think is going on there, right? You're right. There's a lot of implied violence in D&D style fantasy gaming. This is I think we're kind of segueing into the second section here. I mean, I was going to read off some of the rituals here on the air, but I don't think I need to.
No, I don't think that's necessary. But I mean, yeah, and that's the thing. I think that I'm not saying you shouldn't be bothered by what's in Carcosa. You probably should. The argument then is you should perhaps be more bothered by everything else.
Right. Yeah. Well, so that's a great segue. I'm not gonna read off some of the rituals. Let's just go straight into the next part, which is our sort of personal opinions on this idea, right? Like, and we're already hinting at it here a little bit. We already have, you know, I think it is, this is kind of dovetailing off what you just said. I think it's somewhat unfair to treat Carcosa as something exceptional in this regard, right? Even just taking it out of fantasy gaming for a second. There is tons of media out there where this sort of like dark, rapey, you know, murdery sort of human sacrifice type stuff is going on, right? Every pulp adventure where there is a tribe of people who have to sacrifice a virgin, right? Like, there's a lot of like implied stuff going on there, right? Like, this is something that we've lived with for a long time in our culture. I'm not saying it excuses it or I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying that, like, I think it's kind of weird to treat Carcosa in an exceptional way in this regard. You know, very, very popular Game of Thrones and the Song of Ice and Fire, the books that Game of Thrones is based off of, has, you know, there's a pretty striking moment where we learn about a ritual where a sorcerer emasculates little boys and throws their genitals into a flame in order to receive dark sorceress power. So I think that's worth kind of pointing out. I think like you have to take Carcosa in. I think you must acknowledge that this stuff is in our culture, right? The difference, I think what makes people so angry about Carcosa, and we kind of hinted at earlier, is these rituals are presented in a very clinical, matter-of-fact way, right? They're not buried in any kind of narrative. There's no heroes and villains. It's just presented on the page as a sort of matter-of-fact thing. And I think that starkness, that clinical treatment of it, I think that gets people's hackles up. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that is probably part of it. It's really hard to say. I mean, certainly in terms of creating horror, being somewhat clinical or blasé about it is a way that you do that. I mean, imagine if you encountered this kind of thing in, like, yeah, let's talk about Call of Cthulhu, the other haven of problematic content, like a 1920s town where this was one of the things that people did, and you visited it and they went, oh yeah, we're doing the mass murder tomorrow, do you want to come? And they weren't bothered about it. That would be the horrifying reveal for you. So the fact that this is and I think part of the problem was the original version of this as well was presented as, was it like supplement 5 for D&D, and it was in a kind of really 1970s style presentation.
Yeah.
That, I think, did not help. The incongruity of having what's normally a straightforward, relatively, I was about to say unchallenging. That seems like an unfair thing to say, but like a milieu in which you don't have to address the fallout of either the good guys or the bad guys' actions that much, because it's fun kind of Saturday morning serials adventure, to then present it with this kind of nasty early 20th century Pulp Fiction stuff. I think that was a jarring contrast, and that might be what drives it, or drove a lot of the reaction at the time.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, I agree with that. So kind of drilling down on the specific rituals here in the book, one thing I think is worth keeping in mind in terms of content and presentation, and I'm not necessarily defending all the material in the book when I say this, but I do think it's worth pointing out that the rituals that the player characters might be expected to engage with more frequently, which is the ones that banish the monstrosities terrorizing them, those often don't have a human sacrifice component at all, right? The ones that involve the terrible human sacrifices are where you are trying to summon and invoke the power of these monsters. And if we kind of assume that like your characters are good guys, or at least are trying to, just kind of make their way in the world and survive, they're likely to be engaging more proactively with the rituals that are banishment rituals. And so indeed, you may not even be doing those terrible things at the table, right? I think part of what's going on here in the text is, and you kind of mentioned it, or you mentioned it in the first segment, I think that there's a sort of messaging or flagging going on here from the author saying, this is the really bad shit, right? Like, I want you to think about how horrible this is and consider whether you would want to engage with that, right? I think we're meant to say, oh, that's the bad stuff, right?
Well, yeah, kind of, but also that's a very, don't take this the wrong way. That's a kind of trad-ish perspective.
It's
of
a
the
super
kind of
trad-ish perspective, I know. Yeah.
The PCs are supposed to do this and that, right? So, and I wonder if it is, in fact, the OSR approach of the book that kind of forces it to not say that. So, I mean, I think if you play a sorcerer, it may very well be that the main thing you do is not do any magic, but you know about magic, and you therefore know what's required for various rituals, and that means you know what you need to be keeping out of reach of people who are tempted to actually go and do some. I mean, it's like how, people, well, white hat hackers know how to hack a database, but in theory, at least, they don't actually do it, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, to some degree, I'm playing devil's advocate here, right? Which, I'm a lawyer, so shoot me. I'm kind of presenting that argument for sure. And it does have a certain bit of salience with me. I mean, I think that, one of the things I like about the book a lot, and I was going to mention this in the first segment, but I forgot, is I like that it actually sort of reclaims magic as this dark activity, right? I was having dinner with Vincent Baker a couple of Dreamations ago, and he was explaining to me his like personal take on magic, and it really resonated with me, right? Which was, to him, and I agree, like magic should be dark. Magic should be painful. Magic should be dangerous. You know, I personally kind of, I think that like we lose something when we sort of Harry Potterize magic, right? Like I think there's a space for that, but I personally like the idea of magic being this like unfathomably complex, terrible activity, right? I just think it kind of raises the stakes a lot. And I think it kind of creates a sort of sword and sorcery fantasy that I want, you know? And so to some degree, the way the material is presented really, really resonates with me in that way. And I think that's a kind of a good, like, sort of segue to the next little bit here, which is just sort of generally speaking, like, how do you feel about like dark and vile content in your games, Tom? Would you include some of these more gnarly rituals in your game, like either as a quest object or whatever, or something the characters were fighting against? Like, would you make reference to it? Would you include it on screen? Like, just what's your opinion generally in your own personal games, including it?
Yeah, I probably would have if you find a wizard's spellbook in a tower, sure. Whether it would go on screen, probably not. I think I'd suggest that I was going to go through with it and wait for everyone to shout stop. But no, I think I would maybe précis what happens if anyone actually ever goes through with a ritual.
Well, so my answer is different. So I actually, I'm a bit of a public GM, right? A lot of my gaming is done with groups of people who are mixed groups of people, sometimes people I don't even know before we start. And a lot of it ends up on YouTube and on podcasts and things. And so I have to actually like sort of restrain that instinct, right? I have to sort of suppress that stuff. My public GMing face would never put this stuff on screen, right? I wouldn't even make reference to it. I would do the more mild. I'd be focused on the more mild rituals, right? But like in private, I do love the vile and lurid. Like I'm just that person. I love exploitation films of the late 70s, grindhouse films, that kind of thing. I love all that stuff. And I have run Carcosa in a private setting, or I've run Dungeon World in a, Dungeon World, Dungeon Planet, set in Carcosa in private settings that are that, right? Like they're incredibly gory and vile and perverse, right? And going back to your question from earlier, where you asked like, how has Carcosa influenced your gaming? It's influenced my gaming in this really particular way. Even though the majority of gaming I do now, the sort of public gaming I do, does not deal with that stuff, the way I engage with dark shit in Carcosa influences how I present, say, horror material in another context, right? Like we said earlier, this idea of like just presenting the horror and not having any other commentary on it, and not like going for like, spooky noise tropes or whatever, right? Like just kind of presenting the horror of it and letting the players like sort of respond. That is a great technique, right? That's something I've definitely ported over,
Oh, that's long been my final scene of a Call of Cthulhu scenario technique, is to go less verbose and just leave, just say what's happening. And the long silences between your sentences are delicious.
Indeed.
So
and I also think that like playing with like really dark and lurid and uncomfortable stuff, problematic content, I think you can tone it down for like a more, generally accessible, approachable game, but still like take little bits from it, right? Like I think like when you're willing to play in this really dark space, I think you can't help but like take some of that with you into a tamer game and utilize it to great effect, right? And I think that like my well-roundedness as a GM, I think my particular ability to run horror games really well, that's what I'm known for, is is inspired by a lot of that, right? And so I think it's a space that's worth playing in if you have people who are comfortable with it and who are willing to go there with you, right? And that's a great segue into the next bit, which is tools, right? I think expectation setting is really important, right? Setting expectations is major.
Yeah, and there's often an oft-expressed fear is that, like, well, if I tell people that, there's going to be like a scary spider monster in this or something, that'll ruin the surprise. Like, no, it won't ruin the surprise. Don't worry about it. Yep. Just it's fine. I'm not going to go through and like explain how and why. Just trust us on this one. It is fine. So that's one thing out of the way.
Yeah, in the Gauntlet, we use a technique called CATS. Well, not all of us do, but many of us do. CATS stands for concept, aim, tone, and subject matter. And the tone and subject matter parts of that, this is a sort of little presentation / discussion you have, before the game begins. They're really, really important to sort of get the players in the right headspace and to make sure they're comfortable with what's about to happen. On the subject matter part, I like to anticipate what kinds of things I think are going to happen. For example, when I run Cthulhu Dark, a couple of my mysteries I know for a fact are going to have scenes where the investigators find like animals that have injured themselves, or like animals that have been kind of burst open with, disgusting Cthulhuoid goo or whatever, right? And so I always kind of throw out there like, hey, look, we're going to witness some after the fact violence towards animals. That's a thing that's going to happen. I try to like lay out the things that I think might be, problem areas for people at the table. And then also as part of that subject matter discussion, I ask people, doing the technique called lines and veils, I say, hey, look, what kind of stuff do we just absolutely not want to have on screen, or what do we not want to role play? What do we not want to bring up at all? Like, let's put that behind a line. Often it ends up being things like sexual assault, violence towards children, that kind of thing, right? And then there's other things where, the veil part of lines and veils is, well, what kinds of things are you okay with making reference to or happening off screen, right? But that we don't see directly. And we talk about those things. I think that conversation goes so far toward avoiding problems. Right?
Because I think there is a big problem with the question of lines and veils, which is that often people don't want to say what it is for understandable reasons. They're lines and veils. And also, I think much more frequently, you don't know until it happens. Right, you might think you're fine with anything, and then it comes along, and you're like, well.
In which case, we have
the X card. Originally was an actual card with an X on it, but to be honest, nowadays is mostly people just going, "Oh God, no, X card."
Right.
And that means that you just stop what you're doing, kind of maybe rewind a bit, and find another way forward, whether that be retconning out something that's just occurred, or just cutting to black and moving to the next scene, that kind of thing. I find just having the conversation about that is often the most important part. I did it most recently setting up a game for the Dracula dossier, and I could see the group kind of going, why are we even having this conversation? And one guy who's a great guy, but he was sort of smiling at me in a way that sort of was telling me, I can't believe Tom is having this namby-pamby, feelings-based conversation. But it's about Dracula, and vampires are, as we know, the rapiest of all metaphors. And therefore, some stuff is going to come up that will make people feel a bit iffy. And if they feel like they can speak up when it happens, that is all to the good.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out here in this conversation, too, I want to make it really clear. I don't think safety tools and conversations about subject matter I don't think they're like permission to do gross shit, right? Like, I don't think they're like, I don't think it's like a thing that exists so that we can, just really push it hard necessarily, right? But I do think it's important to do because one, there's the expectation setting angle of it. And two, like you said, you just don't know what's going to come up, right? And what ends up happening is you have this space, you create this space where it's not about censoring things. I know a lot of old graybeards and trad people like will always say this, right? And it's a ridiculous argument, but like they'll say, "Oh, you're censoring content. You're being a snowflake or whatever, right? Just all that bullshit, right? That's not what's going on. It's really something quite different. What's going on when you have these conversations, when you use these tools, is you are making sure everyone understands what could happen. And indeed, you are creating a space where you can role play without fear of judgment, right? I think that's really important. Like, if I want to go to a dark place, I've made that really clear to you. I have presented it as a thing that's going to happen, and I cared enough about you and our mutual experience to talk about it right now, right? I think it shows a level of respect, right? I think it creates a certain level of respect at the table, and it makes it an adult space, frankly, right? And I've always gotten really good dark play having those tools on the table. Those tools and those conversations don't do anything to impede like how hard I go, right?
Yeah, I mean, how often do X cards or lines or whatever actually come up once you've started playing?
That's the thing. The X card actually rarely gets used, right? I mean, to me, it's like you said, it's more about just having the conversation and making sure everyone, just people knowing they can self-advocate if they need to is usually enough, right? They actually rarely rely on the X card, right? Like I think in all my many, games that I've run over the last few years, I want to say I've had the X card pulled on me like once, and I think I've seen it one other time in a game, right? So it's just a stupid, ridiculous argument that it somehow stifles play. That's not true at all. Is there anything else you want to say about this overall topic of dark, problematic content?
I honestly can't think of anything else.
Let's go ahead and go to Companion Adventures. Hello. I have two very important things to share with you. The first, after a long wait, Codex back issues are now available on DriveThruRPG, so if you joined our Patreon late and missed some of the earlier issues, you can now round out your collection. The second, the newest issue of Codex, Codex Cold, is available in our Patreon feed through March 2018. Here's what you'll find inside. Firelight, an original powered by the Apocalypse game and Game Chef 2017 finalist. The Wreck of the Void Hatred, a chilling OSR scenario. Balia, which I may not be pronouncing correctly, but is in any case a rural town in Ireland for Monster Hearts 2. Our newest Gauntlet Daddy, Cold Cock. 5 dozen unusual things about the body we just found, a number of original illustrations, and a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey. To get Codex Cold, just make a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by March 31st. That's at patreon.com/Gauntlet. And do check DriveThruRPG for the Codex back issues. Thank you. It's the Companion Adventures. Tom, what's your first companion adventure?
My first companion adventure is, as I mentioned earlier, directly quoted in the text of Carcosa, and that is A Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay. It's a novel from 1920, which means it's available in the public domain, and there is even a LibriVox audio recording, which is, unlike most LibriVox recordings, listenable. And it tells the tale of this guy called Maskell who attends a seance, then meets some weird people, and then travels in some kind of magic bottle to a planet orbiting the star Arcturus, and he meets all these kind of weird people. He grows a tentacle out of his chest where his heart would be, and a third eye that sort of sees different things. And it's just really odd. It's not really good. In fact, I'm going to say maybe it's a bad novel, but I think if you read Carcosa and don't get what's going on, read this and you will. It's that kind of totally alien mindsets. There's a lot of casual murder in it. There's some weird stuff with a guy who's said to play a harp. But when they show up, his harp is actually a lake that he strums. It's weird. And it's very, very Carcosa.
Awesome. I have a number of internet resources that I actually want to call out for companion adventures, but a few of them I think I'm going to save for the part 2 of our Carcosa talk. Okay. In particular, some stuff on G+. There's a fantastic G+ community, some material put together by our friend Ramadan S. And so I'm going to save that stuff for part 2. I do want to say, though, I have made mention of it a few times already. There's this blog post called Talking About My Generation. It was written by Robert Parker. It's a very short, very quick read, but it has a lot of good links and things in it. But basically what it is he essentially he's not talking about Carcosa specifically, but he does mention it in the post. What it is he's basically talking about Masters of the Universe, and he's talking about a very particular age group of kids, myself being one of them. Earlier I said just little boys, but obviously there were little girls too who were into Masters of the Universe and She-Ra, right? But talking about like how we received sword and sorcery a little differently than generations to precede us and come after us. And I think it's a super insightful piece.
Okay, my next one is a film. It's a student film adaptation of A Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay, which was made, in like the late 70s, and it was lost for ages, and then got re-released by one of those cult film DVD lots. And it's just, again, it's very alien and stark. Has these sort of unearthly voiceover bits when people are talking psychically to each other. It's all shot in black and white, but sometimes colorized, depending on which strongly metaphorical part of the landscape the main character is in. It has some terrible early 2000s lens flare effects added to it for some reason. But apart from that, again, basically not a good film, but it's kind of good to have on maybe in the background while you're rolling up your encounters and robots and things, because it really has that alien and alienating atmosphere to it that Carcosa reminds me of.
Well, speaking of background companion adventures, I have a Carcosa Spotify playlist that I have been cultivating for the last few years, and I share it out with every new group who's about to play in that setting with me so that they can also get into my headspace, musically at least. It's basically a bunch of like really menacing, but also kind of science fiction-y synthwave tracks. I'll make that list available in the links.
I also have a couple of bits of music to recommend. One is a concept album by an artist called Vakula, Vakula. It's a kind of smooth, funky house, but slightly prog rock thing. It's called A Voyage to Arcturus. It's based on a novel of the same name written in 1920 by David Lindsay. So that's some background listening. And then also there's a kind of jazz album by Ron Thomas called Scenes from a Voyage to Arcturus, and that's based on a novel from 1920 of the same name written by David Lindsay. What else have you got, Jason?
My last thing is, so the Gauntlet produces a zine called Codex. I don't know if we've ever talked about it specifically on Fear of Black Dragon, but you've almost certainly heard some commercials about it. So one of the issues of Codex, which is available right now on DriveThruRPG, is called Codex Yellow. And the entire issue is based off of Carcosa. It looks at Carcosa from different angles. So not just this sort of science fantasy interstellar version of Carcosa that we've been talking about, the one that Jeffrey McKinney's Carcosa book is, but also like the sort of literary Carcosa, right, as well. Anyway, it has a bunch of stuff for Dungeon World and similar games that kind of interrogates the idea of Carcosa as a setting, including what I think is a really, really fun LARP by Wendy Gorman called The Society of Vegan Sorcerers. And this is a LARP where you play a group of sorcerers who are trying to find vegan-friendly alternatives to the rituals in the Carcosa book. And that's our show. Listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, I recommend going to our website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. You'll find information, all kinds of information there, including links to all the other things that we do in the Gauntlet. We are on G+. Just go to our community section, go to the community section of G+, and search for the Gauntlet. We're on Twitter at GauntletRPG. And we have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/Gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
No, Jason, thank you.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.